Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and dear audience. On behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada, I welcome all of you to the 19th episode of our webinar. And our today's title is Rohingya Crisis: What Canada Can Do. Before we start, traditionally, we do treaty acknowledgement. The Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. We dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Today, we have invited three distinguished panelists, and they're going to speak on the topic as we mentioned, and we express our heartfelt gratitude as they have spared some of their time from their busy schedules. Just to start with, Conflict and Resilience Research Institute is a Winnipeg-based research and advocacy organization founded in December 2017. It researches on local and global conflict issues and finds ways to transform conflicts through peace-building activities. Rohingya Crisis is its signature research project, and its research findings were published by Lexington Books in January of this year. Those who are less aware of the Rohingya crisis, for your information, Rohingya is an ethno-cultural minority group in Myanmar, those who are acknowledged by the state of government of Myanmar out of 135 ethnic groups. They were stripped of their citizenship in 1982, and since 1962, they were oppressed and persecuted heavily by the government of Myanmar in various forms. Total 3 major exodus took place in 1978, 1991, and in 2017. And as a result, we find 1.3 million Rohingyas now taking shelter in southeastern part of Bangladesh, and they also are spread over 7 countries in the world. Canada is the only Western nations who supported Rohingyas from the onset of the crisis. The Prime Minister of Canada appointed his special envoy, Honorable Bob Rae, for this crisis, and a report on the crisis was published titled Tell Them We Are Human in 2018. You can find the report at Global Affairs Canada's website if you need to consult. There are 17 recommendations made in 4 categories. Prime Ministers also announced Canada's strategy to respond to the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar and Bangladesh in May 2018. This response dedicates $300 million of international assistance over 3 years to address 4 key objectives: elevating the humanitarian crisis, encouraging positive political developments in Myanmar, ensuring accountability for the crimes committed against the Rohingyas, and enhancing international cooperation. In September 2018, our honorable members of parliaments unanimously acknowledged Rohingya crisis as a genocide. Specifically, the motion called for the member of parliaments to agree to endorse the findings of the United Nations fact-finding mission in Myanmar that crimes against humanity were committed, that these horrific acts be sanctioned, recognize that these crimes constitute genocide, and call on the UN Security Council to refer the matter to International Criminal Court, and that the senior Myanmar military official be investigated and prosecuted for crimes against genocide. And the whole Canadian government's commitment of $300 coming to an end in May 2021. Again, in June 2019, 34 senators and more than 100 human rights organizations and advocates sent a joint letter to the former Foreign Affairs Minister urging Canada to initiate a proceedings before the International Court of Justice for breaching UN Convention against Genocide. In this backdrop, we are expecting our esteemed panelists would be telling us about their insights on Canada's current and future role in this crisis. Without further ado, dear audience, let me introduce our esteemed guests today. First, Honorable Senator Marilou McPhedran. She was born and raised in Manitoba, Canada, and she was called to the Bar of Ontario named a member of the Order of Canada in recognition of her co-leadership in the successful campaign for stronger gender equality protections in the Canadian Constitution. And she was appointed to the Senate in 2016. She is a lawyer and educator who specialized in teaching and developing systemic and sustainable change mechanism to promote the Women's Legal Education Action Fund. And she is also recognized as a not-for-profit Canadian organizations like LEAF, LEAF, and METRAC. Dear audience, for your information, Senator Marilou McPhedran has deep interest in the crisis itself, particularly the lot of women Rohingyas in the camps. She visited the camps and Bangladesh in May 2019, and we were very privileged to have her with us in a CRRIC organized seminar in November 2019. And our next panelist is Professor John Packer, and he's an associate professor of law and director of Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. He was appointed the inaugural Neuberger Jessin Professor of International Conflict Resolution in 2018. Professor Packer previously held academic positions at the University of Essex, where he was the director of the world-renowned Human Rights Center at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. He has held fellowship at Cambridge and Harvard universities and lectured at universities and professional institutions around the world. Professor Packer is also a very keen and avid follower of the Rohingya crisis. He has spent years in researching the root causes of the conflict and supported all the matters of legal and accountability for the Rohingyas. And finally, we have Gerald Newman. He is the co-chair and founder of Peacebuilding Committee of Rotary Club of Winnipeg, a chair and co-founder of Rotary District 5550 World Peace Partners, a board member of Honoring Indigenous People, and co-founder of HIP Committee of Rotary Club of Winnipeg. So, ladies and gentlemen, and dear audience, we have these distinguished guests with us, and they will be speaking initially, and let us then have the floor open for Q&A sessions. And just to before I hand over the floor to our first speaker, Honorable Senator, let me also add that we are joined today by two observers, the director of the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute, Helal Mahiuddin, and Sharon Okoye, and she is the chief coordinator of Mediation Beyond Borders. So, ladies and gentlemen, our first speaker, the Honorable Senator Marilou McPhedran. Floor is yours.
Dr. Ahmed, can everybody hear me okay? Good.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this invitation and for the opportunity to be on this panel with such esteemed colleagues. I'm getting an echo. Is anybody else? No? Okay, I'm not. Whoa. Is that me or somebody else who's making that swishing noise? Okay. Maybe I could ask if everyone would unmute their microphones while I'm speaking. That might help. I've been asked by Dr. Ahmed to outline some of the details of some of the back-channel work that went on for months prior to the recent announcement by the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Minister Champagne, that Canada would indeed intervene. The exact nature of that intervention was not specified, and I'm hoping that we will be able to have a more detailed discussion about possible messages that could be conveyed to the minister about the options that are available. I just need to be honest about the fact that there are some of the details that I'm not at liberty to share, but to the extent that I can, the overall message that I'd like to convey is that there can never actually be too many messages of support and concern to our government. and it can often never be too late. So my overall advice to the advocates that are with us today is don't hesitate. Even if you think the cause might be lost, still speak your truth, share the evidence, make the points for the kind of change that you need to see, and please also call on those of us who are parliamentarians and remind us that it's part of our job to be responsive and supportive of civil society in a quest to bring about government changes. So I'm going to go back very briefly to the joint resolution of Parliament and Senate, which was then followed by a joint letter from senators focusing on the need for Canada to do more than talk, for Canada to recognize that we have more resources and arguably more expertise that we can and that we should bring to addressing the genocide of the Rohingya people. And in May of this year, Professor Packer and I were fortunate enough to be working together again with the University of Victoria Faculty of Law and with a whole range of experts around the world. We had a round table, and it was conducted over 8 time zones, which meant for people in British Columbia, they were getting up very early. And as a result, we were able to then go on and have conversations with parliamentary secretaries, the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Justice, because indeed, if Canada was going to intervene in the case brought by the Gambia at the International Court of Justice, it would be dependent on the Minister of Justice to make sure that Canada did that effectively. That led to a joint conversation with the Minister of Justice himself. And those of us who co-hosted the May roundtable were able to convey succinct messages that included options for action. And in addition to that, and following that, we were able to have, some of us were able to have a detailed conversation with the parliamentary secretary for the foreign minister. And that in turn led to some additional conversations with senior policy people in the minister's office. And we were actually poised to have a conversation with Minister Champagne himself, but he went ahead and made the announcement prior to when we were supposed to have our telephone call. So I'm going to see that in a positive light. I'm going to choose to see that in a positive light. I also want to place my comments in the context of appreciation for the acknowledgement from Dr. Ahmed about First Nations and Indigenous territories, but also to note that I'm speaking to you from Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Algonquian peoples. And I also want to place in context yesterday's speech from the throne, and to note that there was scant reference to international relations, to looking at Canada's feminist foreign policy. Those words were not used in the speech from the throne. And the one specific reference that I heard was about the continuing illegal, unjust imprisonment of our Michaels, and reference to, in very general terms, the rule of law. So I want to invite everybody with us today to see this as an opportunity to build on that reference to the rule of law and to incorporate in messaging the importance of looking at international human rights as part of the rule of law, and to, I guess, riff off the throne speech, even though there was very little detail, to keep encouraging parliamentarians and the government to pay attention, yes, of course, to the Michaels. This must be a top priority, but also to address the genocide case before the ICJ and to clarify what action is actually going to be taken with Canada and the Netherlands working together. And also to pay attention, for example, to the Uyghur people and what is happening in China. There's a whole range of issues. Later today, I'll be doing a video to draw attention to Nazreen Sotuda, who is a human rights lawyer who has been illegally jailed in Iran, who is on a hunger strike, and it is getting to be a very serious, life-threatening situation. We all know on this call that there is a very, very long list of human rights abuses and of shared priorities that we have to make some very difficult choices from time to time as to what it is that we're going to work on. So let me focus on what I think, and I am speaking only for myself, made a difference in the decision making that we have now seen that has Canada stepping up and taking action consistent with the important words and resolutions and letters that have come from our Parliament. I want to draw attention to the fact that the roundtable that we held in May is still available as an online resource, and that there is a published report. We followed a modified version of the Chatham House rule, so there is not attribution of exactly who said what, but there's a very good summary of conclusions and recommendations that came out of that roundtable. And the fact that both of the panels in the roundtable, and again, I just remind you that we had international experts, including Professor Packer, on the panels, and that the panel that I moderated focused exclusively on the question of sexualized, gender-based violence as a core component to the strategy of the genocide enacted against the people of Rohingya origin in Myanmar, and then continuing. And one of the points that was made that we really do need to keep in mind is that on one hand, we have a case in The Hague in the Netherlands before the ICJ. We have 1 million plus people in camps in Bangladesh. And we have ongoing genocidal actions continuing to occur inside Myanmar, not only against the Rohingya minority, but against some of the other minorities as well. And that this becomes a very important part of how we look forward. And I hope we'll have a chance to discuss that today. On the panel that I moderated, there was a very strong emphasis on making sure that the voices of Rohingya women were heard directly. And one of the reasons for this was to try to make the point to the many government officials who were monitoring and listening to that roundtable that there's tremendous expertise within the Rohingya community themselves. And so we had Wei Wei Nu, who is still resident in Myanmar, who's a young Rohingya lawyer. And we had Razia Sultana, who had moved to Bangladesh as a teenager, qualified as a lawyer in Bangladesh, and has been dedicating herself based out of Chittagong and Cox's Bazar, to working directly in the camps and assisting Rohingya. We also had one of the world's foremost feminist academics who has served in a quasi-judicial capacity, including on the ICC as a judge, and that is Professor Emerita Christine Chinkin, formerly of Oxford, now with London University. And we had also Cilla Radhakrishnan, who is the president of the Global Justice Center based in New York, that has been the source of some of the most focused writing and analysis on sexualized gender-based violence perpetrated against the Rohingya people. And we had commentary as well from Canada's ambassador on women, peace and security, Jacqueline O'Neill, and also from the founding CEO of the civil society organization, the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, Mavic Cabrera Beleza. Mavic was the person who developed with her team at GNWP the whole idea of reaching out to young women in the Cox's Bazar community to work with young Rohingya women and girls in the camps. And it's been an ongoing project. It's been financially supported by Canada. And I will just comment at this point that it's well worth looking at what Canada has been investing in through primarily our High Commission in Bangladesh in identifying community-based projects, including in the camps, and investing in supporting capacity. And so I think one of the opportunities that we need to see developed more is actually a closer working relationship between those in justice and global affairs who are taking responsibility for the intervention before the ICJ, and those who are actively engaged in the investment in building capacity and supporting women and girls and Rohingya leadership in the camps. There's a wealth of knowledge and expertise and evidence that we could be looking at more carefully, I think, than we are now. And as a result of those conversations that we were able to have through the back channels, through the parliamentary secretaries, I think it is fair to say that we helped to keep a focus within those departments, with those ministers, and with the ministerial staff to stay focused on the fact that they needed to make a decision and they needed to take action. I think we were also likely assisted by the fact that the then special envoy for the Prime Minister for the Rohingya situation, Bob Rae, the Honourable Bob Rae, became Canada's ambassador, senior ambassador to the United Nations at our mission in New York. And although he's just started that officially quite recently, there is a continuation of knowledge and concern that I'm hoping will continue to be helpful. So I've reached my time. I'm going to close my comments at this point, and thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Honorable Senator, for, I would say, a very informative part of the discussion today. And we have come to know a lot of resources and Canada's ongoing activities, and especially in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. So the audience will now invite our second speaker, Professor John Packer. Professor John Packer, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed, for the opportunity, and thanks to CRRIC for the initiative. I think we all need to be immediately sensitive to the fact that the subject we're addressing, which is very far away from us, is on a daily basis really at the point of intolerable for a large number of people, not just the 1.3 million you mentioned who are effectively refugees in Bangladesh, and another million distributed elsewhere in the world, or more than that. But of course, the 450,000 to possibly 600,000, we're not actually sure, who remain back in Myanmar, where the situation continues to deteriorate and where the government is not permitting access. So we don't actually know, but we can only imagine, as a now raging conflict involving Rakhine Buddhist compatriots in the state and under the guise of the Arakan army is at really a full armed conflict now with the government of Myanmar and the armed forces. So the Rohingya find themselves now additionally, which was not the case 3 years ago, now additionally really for their lives at the mercy of the situation. Let me just begin add a few more words about the situation today more broadly in which we in Canada find ourselves, so that we can answer the question what Canada can do, and I want to say what Canada should do. So we also have to take account of the fact that global attention is obviously diverted away from situations like the Rohingya, obviously where it goes without saying that COVID-19 has overtaken all interests and concerns of every government and every society around the world. A piece published in Open Global Rights yesterday online indicates that the atmosphere in Myanmar leading up to the November elections has really entrenched a nationalist Buddhist Burman identity, rallying around the army as the protector of the nation, the state-forming nation, the majoritarian definition of the state-forming nation, and that diminishes ever more the position of Rohingya and virtually all other minorities. But therefore, it's not surprising that the Rohingya, of course, have been excluded from voting, any representatives, even acknowledged citizens of Myanmar excluded from standing for office and so forth. So the situation is getting worse there. The humanitarian situation is somewhat stabilized in Bangladesh. Of course, COVID-19 adds additional threats. But in terms of global support and funding, this is now in doubt. It's not just Canada's $300 million package, which is expiring at the end of this fiscal year, meaning March 31st, 2021. But the likelihood of there being high availability of resources from anywhere else in the world and in Canada is small. So, for example, responses to the joint response appeal from the United Nations are lower than in the past. Canada's own ability, nobody said anything at the moment about renewing or extending or adding to. I think this is something we may pay attention to because there is a humanitarian imperative to provide support. And I should say the support from Canada doesn't just go to the refugees, a portion of it does go in Myanmar. And actually that is a question itself, which I would invite close scrutiny to. It's not at all clear how those funds exactly are being used in Myanmar. But I think that it would be a sober, realistic assessment to say that it may not be likely that we will see that $300 million renewed at that level. So there's going to have to be close attention to what is funded and how it's distributed. On the diplomatic level, I've already said this is dropping in terms of attention of the world. There are some international mechanisms that are engaged. The new one, a dedicated IIMM at the United Nations, but it's investigating quietly. It will take a long time. We should not kid ourselves. We're talking not even years, but possibly decades for that to bear fruit. And then there are things like this International Court of Justice case, or the investigations of the International Criminal Court, but we have to be realistic on that. There's nobody actually standing trial, and there's only an authorized prosecutor's investigation, which will, the first action of any attorney in defense will be to contest jurisdiction. So this is by no means, and I would not doubt that there could be many states, both parties and non-parties, but parties to the Rome Statute who may intervene in that to comment on what appears to be, let me say, a tenuous link of jurisdiction in the ICC. So that's a far off matter too. So we're kind of left with the ICJ case and a UN Special Rapporteur because the IIFMM is no longer existent. And the new Special Rapporteur has just come out with his first report. So the situation's bleak, is what I have to say. And what is the role for Canada? Well, before saying what we can do, let me add to that kind of bleakness, I'm sorry to say, what Canada cannot do. So just that we are aware, Canada will not deliver restitution for the Rohingya. Canada will not return the matter to status quo ante. We're not going to facilitate on our own neither repatriation nor other many forms of repair. We cannot save and fund. We cannot even determine how our funds will be used that we make available. Those must be negotiated in conjunction with the multilateral actors and above all with the host states. So, there are those who say, for example, around education, a matter which I know that we have both advocated the education of the Rohingya, but that very much depended upon decisions of the government of Bangladesh. So I'm sorry to say that there's not much Canada can do on its own. So what can Canada do? Well, of course, through multilateralism, and it has taken steps, partly robustly, initially in 2017, 2018, through diplomatic venues. We initiated, convened meetings. I think we've stopped doing that in large measure. We used to convene a regular meeting in New York and elsewhere. I was told that stopped a long time ago. I don't know if Ambassador Ray might reignite that. We did support the IIMM, and I know we funded it. And of course, Canada and Chrystia Freeland attended the OIC Foreign Ministers Council meeting in Bangladesh, and so forth. And our special envoy made a lot of presence known. That's kind of diminished. For example, we don't have a special envoy anymore. I don't know if anyone's that's dawned on them, but by virtue of the appointment of Ambassador Ray, there's not been, and I have not heard a word of any discussion of a possible successor special envoy. But does that mean we have downgraded Canada's engagement on this issue because we were a rare state with a special envoy, and at the prime ministerial level, by the way, and not only for the Rohingya, for Myanmar situation and so forth. So I just place that out there to say, does that mean we've downgraded our engagement? On the bilateral level, we remain, I believe, quite engaged, not only with Bangladesh, supporting them and through different means, definitely with Gambia. We've declared, and we are, to my understanding, actively supporting Gambia's application and at the International Court of Justice. But let me say that the avenues there are relatively limited also. Our ability to persuade, for example, the government of Malaysia, which hosts 250,000 Rohingya also, we have modest ability to influence and so forth. So you can see I'm kind of going through a logical deduction approach here. What can Canada do actually significantly? Well, we can act in our own jurisdictional competences without asking anyone or depending on anyone. So, we can not only make decisions about what resources we can allocate, financial and otherwise, we can decide whether we want an envoy or not, but we can also decide things like, should we accept more refugees? That's not 100% our own decision because the practicalities of it will depend on our relationships with UNHCR and the Bangladeshis and Malaysians and others, but pretty much it's our decision. We could consider that. We could consider, will we create a scholarship program for young Rohingya who are now without any possibilities, and this is a real challenge for the Rohingya community, to maintain its own cultural coherence. And I would say even the survival of Rohingya as a people or as a community depends on the generational transmission of knowledge and the vigorous existence of an intelligentsia, of a cultural leadership. That depends on education. And that's been hugely disrupted for Rohingya now for basically 2 generations. And specifically now when 85% of Rohingya are no longer in their homeland, but are distributed around the world, things like the maintenance of language is at risk. Things like cultural practices are at risk. So Canada could help with those things, investing in supporting Rohingya groups, supporting Rohingya advocacy, voice, and so forth. That's money, but it's also attitude, it's facilities. We can decide some of those things, we could do those things. Now, one of the things we could do, and this is where I really want to get to, is we can also act on upholding things like our declared values and our international obligations. Chrystia Freeland declared in the House of Parliament in June 2017 that Canada would be a vigorous advocate of and upholding the international rule of law, rules-based order, and specifically human rights. Support for the Rohingya and specifically against genocide is an expression of that. And in my view, it's not only expression for the Rohingya, it's an expression in general to the international community. What can Canada do? Well, here I want to emphasize, I want to now switch from what we can do to not only what we should do, morally and otherwise, but what we're actually obligated to do. And here, under the Genocide Convention, Article 9 states explicitly that states parties where genocide occurs or is believed to occur shall bring, where a dispute exists in this regard, shall bring the matter to the International Court of Justice. That's not a choice. That's a mandatory obligation. And the reason is because genocide is such an odious matter and problematical for international peace and security that it needs to be regulated, it needs to be adjudicated. We can't have a world. We learned that in 1945 or in the Second World War and so forth. So Canada's actually obliged. Now, does Canada have a dispute in this regard? Well, in 2018, with the participation of Senator McPhedran and her fellow senators, but also in the House of Commons, we had almost simultaneous and essentially identical, if I recall, identical texts, maybe slightly, I think they were identical, resolutions adopted by both houses unanimously, including our government, our members of our government, including the then foreign minister and our still prime minister and now deputy minister. They personally voted and said there's a genocide. I don't think you can do that and then say you kind of ignore that you've got a difference of opinion, obviously with the government of Myanmar, which clearly has now stated at the ICJ that they don't agree, they disagree. So we're in a position of disagreement. More than that, we declared internationally that we support Gambia. We've been present. Ambassador Ray was physically present at the ICJ when the case was argued orally. And we have declared publicly that we will now allocate resources and support an intervention. We haven't clarified what we'll do about it. But that really does bring us into, so what are the consequential steps of such a declaration and such a position? Are we now going to do the kind of least we can do, a sort of perfunctory nod of the head, issuing a statement for diplomatic purposes, and then let the matter slide? Let me say that our government in the joint declaration with the Netherlands has not actually acted. There's some dispute in international relations and international law whether a declaration constitutes an action. But in fact, they have stated they will act, that they have not actually acted. So we don't know what this entails. And let me now get in a little bit the weeds of what significance this is. It is significant that this declaration has been made, and I commend the government of Canada and of the Netherlands for that willingness to at least politically bind them in a subsequent action, and presumably a vigorous one, a robust one. I don't think in these matters you can be kind of half in. I think it's pretty clear now what position Government of Canada has, what the significance is, carries for its bilateral and multilateral relations, and I presume Canada wants to win. I can't imagine Canada doesn't want to win. So now we have to look at what are the implications here. Well, I'm sorry to add now another bit of negative news. The actual case at the ICJ is not as secure as one might imagine. First of all, the politics of the acting parties is not as secure as one would hope. Gambia itself, you couldn't pick a weaker, unsecure state than Gambia, the smallest state with very uncertain politics, facing elections, a president, a country that's had a history of coups d'etats, a domestic, virtually civil war. The current president said he would only stay for 3 years. He's now backtracked on that. So there's going to be huge contention around his election next year. So that presidential election's coming. We know the Minister of Justice stepped down and left, is out of the picture entirely. Parliamentary elections are spring of 22. So Gambia is by no means a sure bet in this. Moreover, they don't have a red nickel, a penny, as we say, or a nickel or a dime to actually fund. They are not funding a cent of their actual participation. They are dependent in this regard on the OIC and more specifically on Saudi Arabia. And I don't mind saying publicly, I wouldn't want to bet anything on the certainty of Saudi support on this subject matter. So I think that would be wholly naive. So Gambia is not a sure bet in this. Now, if we look at the Netherlands and Canada, well, I don't have to tell anyone who's watching this now, it's not quite clear what Canada's position is going to be in 45 days if we're facing an election, if there's a change of government. We have a minority government. The Netherlands has a coalition government that's even weaker than our minority government. The foreign minister is of a minority party, a small minority party, the Free Democrats. I commend Foreign Minister Stefan Blok, who's acted with considerable clarity of thought and courage in bringing 2 other cases internationally in the last month. One at the European Court of Human Rights, the Netherlands against the Russian Federation. That's an act of courage in regard to the MH17 shooting down. And just last week announcing that the Netherlands will bring a case at the International Court of Justice against Syria for breaches of the Torture Convention. Has Canada acted in those regards? Canada could act in those regards equally and not in the European Court of Human Rights, but it could act under the Torture Convention against Syria. We're not. We're not even thinking about it, as far as I know. So, you know, what could and should Canada be doing with regard to this ICJ case? Well, here, if we are true to our convictions and our declarations, we should be actively engaging, not merely late and perfunctorily as an intervener to comment on the construction of the treaty and its interpretation. We should want to be a party. We should want to bring all of our legal resources. Senator McPhedran is right that we have a plethora of tools. Our Minister of Justice has a specific international crimes unit. We have allocated millions of dollars for that unit to do cases, normally domestically, but could be used otherwise. We have the financial resources. We don't have to ask the Saudis to bail us out or to pay for the submission of a document, which is literally what they're doing for Gambia. And Canada has the ability to retain impressive legal counsel. We could do a lot of things, but that means we have to decide to become a party. And under Article 62 of the Statute of the Court, with regard to the genocide case, we could decide to intervene out of our interest, the same identical interest as Gambia, and we could say we would like to be a party which would protect against the risks that should Gambia withdraw or be persuaded to not act, that the case would continue and Canada would not be embarrassed. I mean, there's a potential here that we find ourselves embarrassed. In addition, we would act soon, because I understand that the intention is to act only under Article 63 and only before the oral testimony after the memorials have been submitted. That means late. That's probably not for a year and a half, or 2 years. So it would mean we don't do anything more than issue this declaration for 2 years. So I think that would be not only incongruent with our position, but it would be basically to be unfaithful to our commitments to the Rohingya. So for all of these reasons, I think that we need to look seriously at what we're doing. And let me add 3 specific tasks, what Canada could and should be doing. First of all, even without saying we're going to engage in the case or intervene, as a state party to the Genocide Convention, we could now, right now, today, issue a request to the Court of Justice to disclose the exchanges under the provisional measures, which are now confidential. It strikes me as plainly absurd that Canada has declared we have an interest and we're going to intervene, but we choose to remain blind to what's actually being argued already by Myanmar. That's just stupid. So I think it would be sensible that Canada, together with others, should call for public disclosure of these documents. Second of all, we should advocate strenuously for Rohingya voice to participate in all stages of the case and in all consultations, not least representative Rohingya voices of those directly affected, including women Rohingya representatives. And third of all, we should make clear the resources we make available to support those voices and groups in a proactive manner, not only in a kind of passive receptive mode. So those are things I believe we should do. And I'm convinced that these would enjoy the support of the Canadian people. This is not costly. This is small money in the big picture. And this is entirely doable. And I would conclude again by saying this is not only what we can do, this is what we should do as a genuine, committed country and people to the support of the international rule of law. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor John Packer. I think it was quite a bit of explanation of the rules and laws. And dear audience, you have a fair idea. And Professor John very meticulously presented the reality of the issue that we are talking about. And thank you very much, Professor, just to provide a reality check, and also that our expectation is not too much on Canada, because even our personal experience in the field work and talking about this issue, presenting papers, we have heard many a times people are expecting so much from our country. So thank you very much for bringing us down to the art, I believe. So dear audience, our next speaker is Rotarian and peace builder David G. Newman, and he is involved in this topic since 2018, and he has participated in many events with us. So David Newman, floor is yours, sir.
Let me say first that I'm going to be brief, but I'm going to raise points because the wisdom of other people in this panel far exceeds mine on the technicalities and intricacies of this issue. I'm going to speak as a recovering lawyer, as a recovering politician, as someone at my age who is reverting to the morality and sense of humanity of my childhood, which I am refreshed every day when I speak to my grandchildren. I really am here to speak for a part of civil society and a mainstream of civil society, and from North America, from our privilege and our freedom and our constitutional democracies, our prosperity. And at a time when North America is deeply troubled, especially to our south. But Canada, over the last certainly 50 years, since the Supreme Court of Canada started addressing in very significant positive ways Indigenous issues. Our Constitution in 1982 took on some recognitions of our Indigenous peoples, which was long overdue. And since then, truth and reconciliation, acknowledgement of our history, apology, beginning to talk about working together, and certainly at a civil society level, actually doing it. And that's what we're doing through honoring Indigenous peoples with mainstream Rotarians across the country. And that's amazingly attracting interest in the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, and that's not surprising either. But in the context of the 200,000 years of humankind and the very limited period of time when we've had organized religion and we've had conflicts growing out of religious misunderstandings and religious doctrine and all those kinds of things, it's time, I believe, to put in the big, huge context the immediate need at a time when humans have the capacity to destroy life on Earth. We have created as humans weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. We have contributed to destruction of the very essences of elements of life. And climate change is a consequence, and we're at risk of extinguishing ourselves. So I was part of the art of the possible world for a period of time, and I rejoiced when I came out of that to be part of the art of the impossible world, which is civil society, because governments, frankly, are just going to be behind the curve. They're going to be behind the right side of history. They're going to be behind what is necessary for human existence, and certainly flourishing humanity and the nurturing of their potential. So when we have a situation where we have a horrendous example of man's inhumanity to men and women, the Rohingya and stateless peoples everywhere, we need to bring this home. And let me do that to Canada. Imagine if our First Nations neighbors to the south were the Rohingya. In other words, they were in an authoritarian regime in the United States of America, driven into Canada. And all 2 million or so of the First Nations that were able to leave. How would Canada respond to that? What capacities would they have? Would they even be close to the way that the Bangladesh people and the Bangladesh state have responded? It seems to me that there's a natural alliance relationship that should form between Bangladesh and Canada really deeply on this issue, both relatively new countries. Bangladesh, of course, much newer than ours and its current democracy, 1867 for us, really 1991 democracy for them. So it seems to me that this is something for the whole world, crying out for moral and humanitarian understanding and mobilization of action from civil society upwards towards the governments that have to make the decisions. So we help them be able to do that. So giving that kind of messaging, so you bring it right home to really what this would feel like in Canada if it were in our face, not in a distant, a long distance away. So here's the specific points I'd welcome being addressed. Aung San Suu Kyi, there's an election November 8th in Myanmar. Human rights person by people like Marilou and Jody Williams and the Nobel Peace Women's Organization, and Dr. Cilla Elwood from the Oxford Group in the UK. And she is now, like me, at a stage in her life. She's in her last quarter, okay? She's 75 years old. She comes from a long history. So I just asked the question as a peace builder, and I speak to Sharon, who's on our call, and think Mediators Beyond Borders International. Because when you think, how do you do transformational change outside government? Well, you do it person to person. In this case, woman to woman. And is there not possibilities there? Is there not possibilities to have actual interfaced relationships, given what might happen after that election if there's a substantial majority in her party's favor? So I just raised that. No one's mentioned the repatriation because it's such a difficult thing, but Hauser's and Hall's book has mentioned it, and they spoke of the role of the United Nations. They spoke of Lloyd Axworthy's great idea about responsibility to protect, which actually emerged into something of value, and that's mentioned in the book. But maybe what you don't need is peacekeepers, you need peace builders provided by the United Nations. So is there a pathway through after this election to move in that kind of direction and provide international support to help build peace if and when, but in preparation for the return of the Rohingya? The final point that I make, it relates to the role of people like Sharon, and I want her, I'll give her time to speak on this, because what MBBI does, I had the great fortune of being in Bali and meeting some people from Myanmar, some amazing mediators, female ones, Muslim ones, who were going into the homes of the remaining Rohingya, and they identified that the best work that they could do was to empower the women in those homes who were not even allowed out of their homes, and they were suffered oppression in any event in that particular situation. So they equipped them and empowered them, gave them skills to help educate their children and so forth. So I'd just like to speak about, we've heard the role of lawyers and human rights and the International Court of Justice. My point on that, having been in Cambodia and hearing the stories in Cambodia, and of course the Court of Justice ultimately only sentenced and dealt with people when they were old, aged, or dead, and the only purpose it served for the Cambodian people in that torturously long process was it ultimately gave a sense of felt justice, that they were acknowledged internationally. But it certainly didn't do a whole bunch for replacing the oligarchy and repressive communist regime there. So I leave that with you, and I really would, Hauser, love to hear Sharon comment, and then my role is done. I want to hear from John Packer and Marilou.
Thank you very much. Sharon, just before handing over, we just wanted to be cautious about time, and the Honorable Senator has some engagement might be. With regards to two observers, Sharon Okoye and Dr. Hilal Mohiuddin, I'd request to kindly comment or question to the presenters only, so that we can complete our session in time. Thank you so much. Sharon, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Kasa and David. I just want to, because I want to reiterate what Professor John Precker said about multilateralism and bilateral levels. At times, when we can't influence, we probably might influence something, but we might not really have that competence in terms of when I always look at the area of competence in terms of, okay, this is what we're actually trying to do for these people. How are we going to get there? We might want to use Bangladesh and it's not working. We might want to use Myanmar, it's not working. What do we do personally? That is why this MBBI peace building idea came about. These people have been suffering a lot. They've been getting aids from many countries, and people are outsiders trying to help them. How can these people help themselves? How do they become their own? How do we teach them how to fish? And we just realize that education is a tool. Education is something that could actually set you free. Professor Pecker mentioned too, giving them scholarship. That is what exactly we are building on. When these people are educated, because less than 2% of them are educated, and I don't even know if they have any kind of university education at all. But when we're able to get lawyers to advocate for themselves, peace builders to advocate for themselves, I think one day Myanmar will call them to the table and say, okay, these people they are bringing, because education gives you knowledge, it enlightens you. So one day they will come to the table and have a negotiation by themselves for themselves. So that is why the peace building, what we're advocating right now, is empowering them educationally and on the highest level of education, actually, because I know many people are working on the basics, which is beautiful, but that highest level gives them a voice. It makes them have some people that are really representing them. And then we are now thinking of then empowering them economically, especially their women. Thank you. I wanted to mention part of what Senator said, but because of time, I will leave it to Helal. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hilal, floor is yours now, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is very straightforward. To my understanding, Canada can do one thing. So there are two things. One is easy task and another one is the difficult task. The difficult task is having a safe zone. We have written in our books about safe zone, and the concept of the safe zone is now becoming prominent even in the government channel in Bangladesh. It's a little bit difficult task, and Canada might contribute quite a lot in developing pressure on the international communities to mobilize a movement for the safe zone concept. This is one. And on the easy part, I think the generational transformation of knowledge that John Pecker has mentioned already, education, we are focusing on that. We must need that. But the problem is that Bangladesh government is not allowing them to have education, proper education, because it is very afraid. The government is very afraid that they will be staying here forever. And it is not the intention of the government to allow them to stay here for more than maybe 2, 3, 4 years, roughly, not 20, 25, 30 years. But we are foreseeing that this problem is not going to be solved soon. Probably they will be staying here for 20 or 25. So if we can think about a safe zone idea, and if anyway we can proceed to that, because the international, as we understand that international relationship is changing quite completely, as John Pecker has mentioned, that Gambian election and Gambian type of democracy and government and coup d'etat is a big problem. We don't really have a very clear indication of the future. And the same thing is happening in Canada as well, because of the minority government, and another one is coalition government in Netherlands. So internationally, we are in a kind of bleak situation and very weaker situation, not that we have a very strong situation there. So on the easy part, I believe that Canada can easily do one thing. This is just helping the Rohingya people to voice more. Now they are voicing through some of the leaders, as John Pecker and Senator Marilou mentioned some names. We know their names and they are very popular. But the Rohingya people themselves are thinking to go beyond that. I am now working in Bangladesh at North South University as a professor. And so I have some first-hand experience of their expectations. They are expecting much more, that yes, okay, they are speaking on our behalf, but there are many other new emerging problems that we need to speak to the global community, share with the global community, but our leadership is not that strong. So we need to voice more, we need to have leadership. So helping them to voice out is one. Another one is to help them to get educated, and to get them educated probably would do best when they are in the safe zone because of the reservation of the Bangladesh government. So I am requesting both the esteemed panelist, Marilou, McPhedran, Senator, Honorable Senator, and John Packer, to reflect on that, whether that could be a possibility and whether we could anyway advocate the Canadian government policy to mold its direction towards these possible solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hilal. I would just briefly have a couple of responses from first Honorable Senator Marilou McPhedran, and followed by Professor John Packer. And I mean, you have listened to all the discussions, and you have listened to the observers' comments. And a couple of quick questions that I would like to flush here, so that our both the panelists are would attempt answering all together. So here is one. I think it is directed to the senator. As she said, genocide is a human rights issue, and how Canada balanced between Myanmar and Rohingyas, because these are the two parties. And I think this is also, is there any plan for resettlement? And so these two, I think, is more close to Senator's speech. And I think one of the questions that came, would request John Packer to comment. How do you see ASEAN as a, because Canada is a dialogue partner with ASEAN, and do you see any role, because ASEAN is actually the only group where Myanmar and other countries are operating together in Southeast Asia? So I would first welcome Honorable Senator to comment in general, whatever she has heard so far. The Senator, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And if I may just ask if everybody could mute, because I'm still getting a tremendous amount of feedback on this. I know that Professor Packer will respond in more detail, but based on some of my diplomatic work in both Thailand and Bangladesh, I want to just observe that the dynamics in ASEAN have a great deal to do with the economies of the countries that are members of that regional organization. And I think often when we're trying to address the genocide of Rohingya, we don't really factor in sufficiently the economic forces that are at play. And I'll just give two examples of that. En route to Bangladesh a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, September of last year, I was in Thailand for a number of time, and I noticed tremendous coverage, like I'm talking full page coverage in the major Thai newspapers about an economic forum that had been initiated by ASEAN, that was co-hosted by a number of countries, where Canada's ambassador to Myanmar was a speaker, and it was entirely focused on the advantages and the priority of economic cooperation with Myanmar. So we do have, I think, a calling to account of speaking perhaps out of two sides of our collective mouth here. The other thing that I observed, and this goes partially to Sharon's point about education, is that after I had been in the camps, I spent time at our High Commission in Bangladesh with our High Commissioner and very capable staff there who are flowing a lot of resources into the camps and into civil society organizations in Bangladesh. And I received an audience with the Speaker of the Parliament of Bangladesh. Now, many of you will know that she began her career as a human rights lawyer. And the Speaker is the second highest ranked authority next to the President in the Parliament of Bangladesh. And we knew each other somewhat from previous meetings. And I already knew that Bangladeshi security forces were monitoring and were present in the camps, in Cox's Bazar, watching who I was talking to and what I was doing. And so, of course, the Speaker acknowledged that she'd had a lot of detail about where I had been and with whom I had spoken and what I had seen. And she stated to me categorically that there would be no education for Rohingya in the camps. And although I think it made our High Commissioner a little uncomfortable, I took that discussion as an invitation to respond to her in legal terms. And here's where some of the questions about international treaties and their usefulness, this is just a small example. But I was able to look her in the eye as a colleague and say, you know perfectly well that the Convention on the Rights of the Child guarantees education to every child wherever they are. You know that. So you know that the longer Bangladesh is in contravention of its promises in international human rights, the worse it looks. So that was a year ago that conversation occurred. And you will know, many of you, that in that year, we have actually seen a lessening of the limits on providing education in the camps. And that has had, I think, a lot to do with various ways in which Bangladesh has been reminded that on one hand, we are very grateful as a global community that the Rohingya were allowed into Bangladesh, but that the continuing limitations that have gotten worse and worse in this last year, including access to social media, for example, in my opinion, and I do speak only for myself when I say this, this has a great deal to do with the economic relations that are seldom factored in when we're trying to understand what is and is not happening in terms of Rohingya and their international human rights. And I think we need to bear in mind that Bangladesh owes a lot of money to China. I think we need to bear in mind that the August 25th announcement that Rohingya were going to go back to Myanmar was engineered primarily by China. And Bangladesh was responding to what China wanted. So it makes the situation all the more complex when we look at what should be a straightforward right, such as the access to education. To Halal, let me just briefly say that to the points that you raised, I think there is a continuing opportunity for communicating with policy advisors in the ministers' offices. I'm not talking about the ICJ case here. I'm talking about what more can be done to support civil society, what more can be done to respect the international rule of law. And I think often the folks in Ottawa don't hear very much from academics and advocates in civil society. And I just want to encourage everyone to keep those channels open and to keep the information and the recommendations flowing. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, for, I would say, a very candid response to a couple of observations. Professor John Packer, if you would like to comment on the questions raised so far, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think that was revealing what Senator McPhedran shared. And I would say that the example of the conversation invoking international law, in this case specifically human rights law, to the speaker who holds a doctorate of law in international human rights law from the University of Essex, in fact, where I used to teach. She's not only fully aware of it, but they know a country like Bangladesh, whose own history emerges and its own standing depends upon recognition and the reliability of international law. They know that they cannot easily ignore those obligations. So I think it's quite powerful, actually. And we know that Bangladesh has changed its position after, in fact, it changed it just as I was in Bangladesh at the end of January this last year. Right afterwards, they finally, not because I was there, coincidentally, I think it was the very end, 31st of January, 1st of February, where they did change their position on the availability of education. And my understanding is that they
John, you are breaking up. We are the audience. I think Professor John is having some connection issues. We'll wait for him another couple of seconds, and then we'll go to the. Yeah, I think he's coming back. Hi, John. Yeah, you are back again.
Okay. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can. Go ahead, please.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened there. Such is the technology. But let me quickly just respond to a few other points. The point about safe zones, I presume you mean in Rakhine State. The problem is that safe zones have a terrible experience, notably in former Yugoslavia and elsewhere, where they actually facilitated
John, I think your connection is again.
What will Myanmar be prepared to accept and be persuaded to accept? And I think it requires international presence, and there needs to be advocacy for this. And so I would like to just say, I don't see Canada advocating for almost anything, really, as Senator McPhedran just said. You mentioned ASEAN. I attended in December last year at a request of the United Nations, the last ASEAN United Nations. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
I was the only Canadian of 170 participants, including from ASEAN Regional Forum. Canada is a member of ASEAN Regional Forum. We have a right to be present. More than that, we fund ASEAN directly, and we fund ASEAN. Diplomat. We had no representation. Non-ASEAN Regional Forum states had representation. It was ridiculous. And there were major, Canada actually has an embassy in Hanoi. They didn't even know the meeting was taking place. So let me just say, we can't be advocating anything if we're not present. at the meetings. And it really does beg question, what are we doing? The fact of the matter is that there is a geopolitical competition over Myanmar, and there is very much a divide about kind of pro-China versus almost everybody else. And ASEAN itself is caught in between, and there's a very deep divide in ASEAN to kind of play it both ways. In fact, Vietnam was very candid about that. They said they need to keep both China and the Americans and kind of everyone happy because they want to trade with everybody. So this is a problem, and Canada needs to get its oar in the water, if I may put it that way, or its paddle in the pond. We need to say our position, and we need to be advocating for how things could be done. And I just don't see us doing it. What we know is that even the long-term economic interests, and I do think they coincide here, the long-term economic interests will depend upon stability and for example, the security of investment, even for the Chinese. So, it's not good that there's basically a couple million people on either side of the river between Bangladesh and Myanmar, where they're trying to create economic zones of prosperity, and it's potentially a hell of a mess, even with insurgencies and now with the Arakan army. So I think an argument about stability, of reliability, of rule of law plays into economic prosperity. And that's a kind of argument we should be advocating. The Bangladeshis are interested in it. Ultimately, even Myanmar is interested in it. Definitely the Chinese are interested. They don't want to see their their big investments in Sitwe and for the railway and the pipeline. They don't want to see those sabotaged. They don't want to see people afraid to invest because they're not sure about the reliability of contracts and so forth. So we need to be making those arguments, and I don't see it.
Thank you, Professor. Just before we go to the final session today, a technical question came from an audience. If Bangladesh is not a signatory to 1951 Refugee Convention, does it make a weaker case for Bangladesh not to abide by some of the obligations stipulated in the convention?
If I may say quickly, I don't think it's that material. You probably know that none of the countries in the region are party to the 1951, or very few. As far as I know, I think almost none of them are to the 51 Refugee Convention. But Bangladesh has not said that they will not respect, the principle of non-refoulement, which is an underlying principle, and the right to seek asylum. Those are already existing international standards, and Bangladesh does not reject those principles as such. In fact, generally, Bangladesh has been respecting them. They are simply not, the 51 Convention includes procedural elements, obligations to cooperate with UNHCR, and a number of things. I think we need to, of course, it would be nice if Bangladesh would become a party to the 51 Convention, but I think fundamentally, we should be relying on the principles of non-refoulement, the right to seek asylum, and like Senator McPhedran said. Sorry, I still call her professor sometimes. Senator McPhedran said, there's hard obligations in things like the Convention on the Rights of the Child that apply to everyone, and Bangladesh is a state party and has no problem acknowledging that. It simply needs to apply it.
Thank you very much, esteemed panelists. So we are at the fag end of our session, and as a tradition, we go back to our esteemed panelists to have their last words, if I may put it like that. We'll go as we started. We'll start with the Honorable Senator first. Senator, your last words, and followed by Professor John Packer and David Newman. Senator, the floor is yours.
I'm going to actually say something that just occurred to me. I want to share it with anyone who wants to commit to a kind of advocacy on this. We are in a minority government, and the NDP is crucial to this. And I really encourage reaching out to members of parliament in Winnipeg who are NDP. So immediately Blakey comes to mind, Daniel Blakey, Leah Gazan. And this may not be on their radar, but I think it's really worthwhile reaching out as Winnipeggers, as Manitobans, to Manitoba NDP MPs and ask them to make this more on the agenda of the NDP.
Thank you, Senator. Professor John.
I will second that entirely. We often ask ourselves, what can we do as individuals? Mr. Newman correctly said we have the enormous good fortune of living in an open democracy. We are free to express ourselves. We are free to make such requests of our representatives or those who seek to be our representatives. So I think this is, really a question of individual conscience of good citizens to say, what are we ourselves going to do? And what we can do is we can voice those requests. We can ask our representatives to be more forthcoming, to be more engaged, to make demands that our international engagement is robust and consequential and lives up to the kind of values that we declare to be Canadian.
David, please.
Sure. My comment just builds on what Marilou and John have just said. And my challenge is to everybody, everywhere, to do the kind of thing that has been advocated, and that is to be a voice. Let your voice be heard. Cry out for bold, moral, and humanitarian action, and personalize it, and just be so grateful that Bangladesh allowed 1.3 million people into their country. Would we do it in Canada when we have far more space and far more prosperity and far more ability to deal with it? So we have to grow up in Canada. We Canadians have to grow up. We have to accept more responsibility for the whole world. And privileged countries have to do this. Our American friends to the south, hopefully this will happen as time passes after November 3rd. So this has to happen for the sake of the not just the flourishing of global humanity, but its very survival.
Thank you very much. Dear audience, we have a wonderful session, and you have heard all the panelists and the observers and the questions from the audience. So if I need to sum up, a couple of things came out very, I would say very clearly from today's discussion. The senator emphasized on raising the voice, sharing your concerns with your local member of parliaments and those who are involved in human rights issues. And she is very aware of the situation down in the camps, and she candidly shared her experience with us. Professor John Pecker gave us, I would say, a very balanced view of the matter, what Canada should do or Canada can do. And this is how we make a balance of our responsibilities and actions. And Mr. David Newman rightly said that, if we do not cry out, then our concerns cannot reach to the people that we ought to serve. So if we wrap our discussions today, I would like to say that Conflict and Resilience Research Institute is actually involved in the education of Rohingya adolescent females in the camps. We right now have one project undergoing, and which is generously funded by MCIC in Manitoba International Council. And we are seeking Rotary Global Grant funding from Rotary International. We are still in the in the last phase of the funding application. Hopefully we would get that. And these two projects are particularly aimed at educating females in the camps mostly. And this is how we want to see that real change happens with regards to Rohingya stranded in Bangladesh. So once again, dear audience, thank you very much for your time with us. And we once again would like to appreciate the time and energy the esteemed panelists had put on today to make it a successful event. Thank you very much from Conflict and Resilience Research Institute. Be safe and stay happy in this trying time. Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you.